Okay, last time I wrapped up talking about self-monitoring, which has to do with how people are responsive to the social situations they find themselves in. But that doesn't really fit entirely with our idea of social cognitive theories, right? Because not only should situations and environments be affecting how people behave and affecting things about how their personalities express themselves, but people's personalities also predict the environments they choose and the situations they put themselves in. So people do, of course, create their own social environments by how they think and act and how they understand and construe those environments. So, an example of how this works might be thinking about extroversion. Introverts, people that are more likely to, get depleted by social things and feel like they are better off sometimes with disconnection from other people. Extroverts being people that are kind of energized by social situations and like to be the life of the party and things like that. So introverts and extroverts create different social realities when they're getting to know other people. Extroverts, when they're getting to know others, they engage in more what we might call pleasure talk, things about similarities, complimenting each other, and talking about a much wider variety of things. And extroverts are going to engage in more problem talk. So discussing situations that they're engaging in, things they can do to finish something at school or accomplish something at work. So the social reality we create when we're even meeting someone is in part determined by our personalities. But it's not just social environments that personalities are related to. We create different physical environments based on our personalities. So some very interesting studies that look at people's dorm rooms and bedrooms and offices and relate those to people's personality show there are very strong relationships between people's personality and the type of space that they create for themselves. But not only that, that people can judge others accurately based on seeing nothing but their dorm room or their office or their bedroom. If people in some of these studies fill out a personality battery for the person whose bedroom they're looking at, just by looking at how they arrange their stuff and what they have, people can be very accurate in judging other people's personalities. So people that are more conscientious are going to have a more cleaned, organized, and uncluttered space. People that are high in openness will have more decoration, more different books, CDs. Well, I guess not CDs anymore, but things like that. CDs at the time the study was conducted. And they'll be more distinctive. People that have more agreeableness will have brighter colors, more cheerful, comfortable sorts of things. And people low in emotional stability might have stuffier or darker rooms. So we create these environments that we then inhabit. And this is also true for social media. There are studies where people fill out personality batteries in the very same way for themselves and their social and provide their social media profiles, and then other people fill out batteries based on those profiles, and people can very accurately predict other people's personalities from how they curate their social media presence. Very interesting. Um, Important to remember that personality is focused on these individual differences that we think about as traits modernly. We didn't really think about it so much. You can tell some of those older ideas that we talked about are more idiographic, thinking about unique aspects of a person. But since the 80s or so, we're pretty, as a personality field, set on thinking about traits of people. But it's important to remember that these are not the only aspects of personality. They don't tell us much about people's motivations or goals or how they see themselves or what's really important to them. So we might do well to think about personality as having some nested levels in a sense. That traits are maybe the most basic biological level of personality, but the way those traits interact with your environment and your behaviors might give rise to something more complex, your motivations. And we might think about motivations, stuff we talked about a couple chapters ago, as part of your personality, partly determined by your traits, but you know, interacting again with the environment and your behavior. So, what do people want? What do people want to achieve? How do they want to do it? Why do they do it? Those types of things are reasonable to think of as an aspect of personality. Maybe even more complex than that are the narratives that people put together for themselves. We all kind of, we vary on this too. Some people do this more than others, but frequently we think about ourselves as like a character in a story. There are narratives around our lives that we tell ourselves about our successes and failures and problems. And this fits into how much meaning we see in our actions and outcomes, who we feel like our identity as a person, if we have a sense of purpose. This is probably closer to what idiographic psychologists are thinking about when they're thinking about those really unique aspects of a person's history. It probably has something to do with their narrative, right? So it's not that these idiographic and nomothetic approaches are totally opposite. It's that they just might be looking at these levels from different directions. That personality traits are more basic and biological, but they give rise to more complex things like motivations and narratives that are going to be relatively unique among people, or at least give us a sense that we are unique. Okay, I want to wrap up talking a little bit about personality assessment. This is something that happens of course, in research, but also in clinical settings. Personality assessment might be useful to identify certain disorders or identify what type of counseling or treatment might be useful for people. It's also becoming more and more used in industrial organizational psychology and management to try to, construct teams that are going to work well together and understand how to be responsive to people in your organization or your employees and promote their success by knowing what traits they have and how we can foster them. And there are lots and lots of different ways you can assess personality. You can have scales, like I've talked about quite a bit, and people rating themselves, like the Big Five Aspect Scale. You can do projective tests, like that thematic apperception test I started with at the beginning, kind of putting ideas onto an ambiguous scene. You can have physiological measures, like how people react more or less to different stimuli. You can have behavior sampling, where you have people record different things that they are actually doing in their lives. Behavioral assessment, which might be a more clinical tool to think more purposefully about people's narrative behaviors, I guess. You might have other people rate someone, and you might have interview data from clinicians and researchers who, are getting a more in-depth profile of a person. Some of the more common ones, self-report inventories, they are going to have different items that you're responding to, saying how true they are, or how much you agree of them, or how much they describe you. And I've mentioned one of these, the Big Five Aspect Scale, but there are many well-validated tools that maybe just use different types of traits. The MMPI, Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory, and the NEO, revised NEO Personality Inventory, that are used more. The MMPI and the NEO tend to be used more in IO psychology and clinical psychology. Big Five Aspect Scale is going to be used more in social and cognitive psychology. But they are similar in their repute. They are both well respected, or all three are well respected tools. Projective tests are a little less, they're a little more subjective in a lot of ways, like a Rorschach test, where you see ink blots that kind of look like butterflies and you're supposed to say what you see in them and tell stories about them. And that thematic apperception test, where you're trying to put a narrative on a scene. These things are more subjective. They're a little less well validated. They might be useful tools to get people thinking in a clinical setting, but they're not really assessing personality in the same way that these kinds of self-report inventories are. To talk about one specific type of measurement, too, I want to talk about someone who studied under Freud, someone you have maybe heard of, Carl Jung, who he had various disagreements with Freud, as many people did, and was kind of his protege until they parted ways in the early 1900s. Jung was very interested in dreams and how they do and do not relate to people's experiences. And he talked about something he called the collective unconscious that had all these, basically something we inherit at birth about what the world is like, and these different types of social, cultural archetypes, like motifs across cultures, different figures and events. And he suggested there are these different types of psychological functioning. these different dimensions: more introverted, more extroverted, more thinking, more feeling, more sensing, intuiting. And again, these were things that he, much like Freud and other people at the time, just kind of came up with from their observations. It wasn't very empirical. It was just kind of like, oh, it seems like this is kind of what people are like. But they were uber confident white men. So this is what they decided was true about different things. So fast forward a few decades after Jung's death, and you have the development of something called the Myers-Briggs Personality Indicator. Catherine Briggs and her daughter Isabel Briggs Myers were people who had various jobs. I think the daughter was in architecture at some point. They both had things to do with like administrative type work, and they came up with this personality indicator, very heavily inspired by Jung's dichotomies, those introverted extroversion, thinking, feeling, sensing, intuiting, but they added on another one, judgment, perception. And if you have taken a test like this before, these different things might sound very familiar to you. This is the basis for when you hear people say these different letters, like I'm an ENFJ. That means they're a more extroverted, intuitive, feeling, judgment type person, as opposed to, you know, someone else across this way that you can indicate these different aspects. You can basically be one or the other on all these different things. You can be an introvert or an extrovert. You can be an intuitive or a sensing person. You can be a thinking person or a feeling person, a judgment person or a perception person, was how Myers and Briggs put this together. And you maybe have seen these things adapted to different pop culture stuff. What drink are you? What Harry Potter character are you? They tend to be very popular, clickbaity type things that are out there in the world. And if you compare these things to the Big Five, those four traits map on somewhat well to some of the Big Five traits. Unsurprisingly, maybe the strongest one is introversion, extroversion is very strongly related. Sensing and intuiting has to do with openness, roughly, and weaker correlations here. Thinking, feeling has something to do with agreeableness, and judgment, perception has something to do with conscientiousness. So they do kind of roughly measure some things that we know are real, but it makes this big cardinal error in quantitative psychology that instead of using a spectrum, a continuum, like these traits, like your score on the Big Five aspect scale when you're measuring extroversion is going to be combining 20 questions on, you know, a 7-point response scale. So there's going to be a range of 140 possible places ish you could be along the introversion extroversion continuum. Myers-Briggs asks you a few questions and basically says, you're an introvert or you're an extrovert. It doesn't make any room for the things in between. And we know most people are in between. It's a normal distribution of people along most of these traits, such that most people are in the middle. And the Myers-Briggs scale says the middle doesn't exist. You're introverted or you're extroverted. You're sensing or you're intuiting, which is bad science. So personality traits should be thought of as continuums or continua, not these dichotomies. And forcing people into one of these two groups for all of these things, and then eventually one of 16 groups, is a very unreasonable thing. It is a very bad measure of personality. So why is it used? Well, it's intuitive to people. People like to feel like they fit into a group like these things. It tells people what they want to hear frequently because, as you might notice from these, all of the roles here are kind of flattering in one way or another. Teacher, counselor, mastermind, field marshal, champion, healer, architect, inventor, performer, composer, operator, promoter, provider, protector, inspector, supervisor. These are all like some archetypal roles that kind of fit into ideas that Jung had, basically. But it also is vague. These descriptions of people that just get written up by whoever owns the Myers-Briggs rights at the time, they're vague enough that they're never, ever, ever wrong. You can read something into all of these descriptions that say something about your strengths and weaknesses. People pay a lot to become the administrators of these types of tests. like thousands of dollars. And this, in general, generates millions of dollars for the rights holders of these tests, and by extension, sometimes the journalistic entities that use them as clickbait sometimes in other settings. But um, you'd be surprised to maybe find out that almost 90% of Fortune 500 companies use something like this to, in their human resources areas and things like that. But maybe the most critical thing I'll say of any area of research this entire semester is the Myers-Briggs type indicator, which, geez, I have so little respect for it here that I didn't even put it in the right order. The MBTI, the Myers-Briggs type indicator, is basically just a horoscope. You can feel like any one of those things is right. And it's unreliable. You might feel one way one day and something else the other day. So you might feel like a teacher one day and an architect the next. It's an extraordinarily unreliable scale that should never be used by anyone that is taking their personality indicators seriously. So with my possible I mean, I'm not going to get sued by anybody because this isn't the first time anyone has said this, but it's bad. Be critical of it. The end.